Welcome to the session on policies and procedures, promoting program excellence. They really are a pretty essential part of your programs, whether grantee, project sponsor, and even serving, clients to have policies and procedures. So with that said, our speakers today, I think you've probably been introduced to all of them several times. So is Rita Flegel, OHH, Jonathan Sherwood, Cloudburst Consulting Group, TA Provider Extraordinaire, and I'm Lauren Deigh with Technical Assistance Division. I will tell you that those who are using the Spanish interpretation, you'll be on channel 8. And we're going to go through the presentation. It's jam-packed, but we are going to leave plenty of time for questions. The most efficient thing is to put them on your app and send them to me, and then we'll read them aloud and get responses, and then, as needed, maybe have more time for from the floor questions. I think that's it. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. It takes me a minute to get this adjusted, so there. So I'm Rita Flegel. I'm the director of the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing. I'm glad to see so many people still here on Friday. I know you're just so excited to talk about policies and procedures on a Friday in Tampa. Woo! And I'll start by saying this is the first time for me presenting this information. Maybe for Jonathan, I'm not sure. It's barely, okay, here we go. Let's try. Is that better, maybe? Okay, thank you. Yeah, you'll have to let me know because it sounds really loud up here. So appreciate that. So just make sure you're in the right session. As was mentioned, this will be repeated at 1:30, so if folks are still going to be around then, if you don't want to stand, feel free to come back and catch us on the next session. It'll probably be even better the second time. So let me see if I can, there we go. As you can see, these are our objectives for this session. We're not getting into specific details of what has to be in every policy and procedure. What we're really talking about is that you need them and how, just an overview of how they should be working. So I want to do a quick check-in. How many folks in the room represent grantees? Oh, that's a lot of grantees. Okay, so project sponsors, a few. All right. Right, we're grantee heavy in here. But today we're talking about a subject matter that pertains to both grantees and project sponsors. Just a quick definition when we talk about policies and procedures. Policies we define as your stated standards that determine all major decisions and actions, right? So they are your policy. Those are your guides for how you make every decision. Procedures are the specific methods that you use to carry out those policies. So those are your day-to-day actions, how you carry them out. All right. So you'll see this in every presentation, just as a reminder that this is the theme for the Institute, and we are trying to gear our minds toward thinking about how does this work have to have impact on ending the HIV epidemic in our country. And so as we're going through, keep that in mind. Even something that seems sort of mundane, like policies and procedures, how can we make sure that we're affecting change in ending that, the epidemic? Okay. And we'll also have these slides throughout. These are the topics that we'll be covering for the day. So as you can see, for the first topic, who needs policies and procedures? Who needs them? And the answer is pretty simple: everybody. You need them. So seriously, though, who should have them? HOPWA grantees, there's so many of you in here, we're talking to you. You need to have policies and procedures. So everybody in here, actually, whether you're a project sponsor, we'll talk about you specifically in a minute, too. You should all have policies and procedures. We're going to talk through some major activities that you should have policies and procedures in place to cover. But these are just the very basics that you should be looking at as a grantee: covering your community-wide policies and standards, framing your compliance requirements for your project sponsors. That's a big one for you. And then describing your monitoring and oversight. How do you accomplish that? Project sponsors, I think I'm going the wrong way with this. Project sponsors, yours is a little bit different from what's required of a grantee. You also have a requirement to have policies around financial reporting requirements that should align with your grantee policy. So you're not doing things different than the way that they have in their policy. And in addition, project sponsors often have extensive policy requirements for the delivery of services. And those should be very detailed and have good procedures to outline how you carry that work out day to day. And do we have grantees that also provide direct services in the room? Yeah, so you need both, right? You have to have both kinds. Let's move on to something fun, true confessions. So you don't have to raise your hand, grantees, this time. Unless you want to admit something to HOPWA.
Field office rep may be in the room.
Yes, so this is a gut check. How many of you need to confess that you don't have policies and procedures that meet the guidelines that are shown here? Oh, wrong slide. How many of you have written policies and procedures? Nope. That was not a lot of hands, by the way. And we say written because so many times I hear people say, oh, we have a policy on that. And when you ask to see it, somehow it's not there. So it may be handed down, it may be verbal, or we've always done it that way. And that's not necessarily the same thing as a written policy, right? So do you know where to find HOPWA program regulations and guidance? And that's a tough one because that's shifty, right? And being up here, I can say that. So, HOPWA statute and reg are your, that's the standard for setting policy. Right now, the HOPWA statute and reg don't even agree on some things because we haven't updated all our regs to match statute, right? So we have temporary guidance in place to bridge that. So you have to know where to find those things. If everybody signed up for the listserv for HOPWA, yeah, make sure that you do that because if guidance comes out that would affect your policies and procedures, you're going to see it that way. So if you ever have a question about which one of these things is the latest guidance for my policies, feel free to ask us that because we want to make sure that we're all in compliance. And sometimes there are other pieces of guidance that come out not from our office, but through OMB or other programs. Like, who knows what 2 CFR 200 is? Yeah, we have to comply with that. So policies have to comply with that too, even though that didn't come out through OHH. So there's different guidances out there, different regs that you do need to follow. Make sure you know how to find that. Do you have standard HOPWA forms? Are they standardized? Have you trained your project sponsors on HOPWA guidance, on guidelines? Do they know what your policies are, what you're requiring of them? And here's a good one. How many of you have made your HOPWA policies and procedures available online? Yeah, so a few have, and that's a really good practice for transparency. So everyone is on the same page, and there's nothing hidden about the way that you're operating your HOPWA program. Now let's move on to true confessions for project sponsors. How many of you have written HOPWA policies and procedures? No, you don't have to raise your hand. Hopefully you do. You have them. And again, they need to be written, so make sure that you have that down. Do you know where to find HOPWA program regulations and guidance? And why is that important? Do you need to sometimes make sure that what you're doing is in compliance? You might be doing something that the grantee is not an expert in, right? That you might need to know that. So make sure that you have that too. What about coordinating your HOPWA policies with your grantee? Do you share that? Have you seen each other's? Yeah. And do you use the materials that are provided by your grantee or by HUD? So you're not creating forms and calculators and different things on your own. Not that we've seen that, but we've seen that. On to the next topic. Why? Why do we need to have policies and procedures? Why should we spend that time? It's time consuming. It's true. It's very time consuming to have good policies and procedures in place. Wait. I missed a page. So well-organized and developed policies and procedures are the key to coordinated HOPWA grant management. So HUD policies that we have at our level flow down to the grantee level and then to the project sponsor level and into implementation. And what this means is the goals and the rules and the intent of the federal HOPWA program are actually carried down all the way to the client level, and that's how it should operate. So that everything that Congress is saying to us, this is how we want these federal dollars used, is actually how we're using it in compliance on the ground. And it takes all of us to make that process work. Okay. Another reason why is because having those solid policies promotes excellence in your program. And it promotes that excellence by making sure we're coordinating our standards and requirements across all our planning and procurement documents. That includes action plans, consolidated plans, the HOPWA procurement processes, and HOPWA contracts. So we're not, doing it one way one time and another way another time. And also for those that are grantees, it's really key to ensure that your policies are coordinated with the consolidated plan to make sure that you are doing things in the way that will carry out those activities that are funded through that plan. Another reason it promotes program excellence is by giving that community-wide framework for all HOPWA operations and provides some consistency in program implementation. So it's ideal for grantees to have policy standards for all the project sponsors across all their activities so that one project sponsor isn't doing something one way and another doing it another way, so that it's fair and equal for people living with HIV regardless of which project sponsor they go to for assistance. So do your communities have those kinds of community-wide planning sessions or policy standards? Is that a typical thing that you see in your communities? I think it's difficult because there's barriers to that, to agreeing on how to do it. And also, particularly if you're funded by other federal programs, so it's not uncommon for organizations to have continuum of care funding and HOPWA funding, or ESG funding and HOPWA, or Ryan White and HOPWA. And all of those have different regulations and different standards. So what we're talking about today is specifically for HOPWA, but to the best of your ability, trying to coordinate that so that you have a standard or policy that can meet all of those. So that's pretty challenging, right? Anybody have an example you want to share of how that works? Nobody wants to? Okay, we're gonna test you later on that. Okay. And so this is recap. Policies and procedures promote program excellence by bolstering local capacity to understand and comply with HOPWA regs. So that's the key, is as grantees in particular, it's your role to make sure that your community understands what HOPWA intends for those dollars that are flowing down and providing that consistent framework. For organizations that provide, sorry, was that the same? I think I missed a slide here. Oh, no. For organizations that provide assistance directly to clients, you should have those clear policies for carrying out activities. and train your staff to carry out policies and procedure and to follow those procedures. So training is key on that. It's important to have consistent operating standards for assistants, and making sure that clients understand and know how to appeal those policies or how to get a waiver or exemption from policies, so that they're not so inflexible that you can't meet the need. And make sure that there's fair and equal access to HOPWA resources. So what happens when you don't have those kind of policies in place that are fair, or if they're not known by the staff, then what happens? Staff has to make things up as they go, right? They're not sure how to handle it. And if you leave it to staff to make decisions on the fly, it's going to be handled differently case by case. And that sets you up for potential legal action. Fair housing laws could be broken. Services could be provided out of compliance with law. And if staff have to make up their own minds about how to carry out the day-to-day work without those policies and procedures in place, you're going to have a lot more work than you would have had by just providing the policy and procedure and training them on it. So moving on to a little bit of basic information about what should your policies and procedures include. As I've already said in this institute more than once, if you've seen one HOPWA program, you've seen one HOPWA program. They vary widely. They do a lot of different things, and that's a great thing about our program. It's really flexible. It's not enough money, I'll say that, but it is flexible to bend and shape and be what you need it to be for your community. So the policies and procedures should also vary widely and be tailored to the program, to that community's model of how you use the HOPWA funding. So what do we mean by tailored? For example, that might mean you might have a policy about allowing pets in a facility if you have a provider facility. So that would be a decision point that you would need to develop a policy around that. But if you only provide STRMU, do you need a pet policy? No. So that doesn't apply to you. So you can't just copy over what someone else is doing. You need to tailor your policies to what you're doing. However, I would say to make sure that you're following federal guidelines on that. So there are some things that are not your decision point. So you could not decide, we're going to support households with 100% of AMI because we see a need for that. Well, that's out of compliance with statute. So that's not a decision point that you get to make locally. Okay. And we're going to talk about some things, but I'm going to point out the slide says this is not exhaustive. There are so many policies and procedures out there. There's no way for us to cover them all. We're going to delve into some of the more standard ones, but there are some really interesting policies and procedures that I've seen and worked on over the years. So let's look at some grantee policy and procedure basics. Okay. So again, making sure that you have a description of all your activities. So if you have a line item for it in your HOPWA grant, make sure that you have a description of what that is and that it's synced with your consolidated plan and your action plans. Activity-specific policies and standards. That's particularly if, again, if you're carrying out, or if you wish to describe how project sponsors carry out direct activities to clients. Yes?
Advance.
Oh, advance it. Thanks. Sorry.
That's fancy.
You were so fancy. Standards for housing needs assessment and planning. So how are you going to carry out those activities in the community? And again, that feeds back into your action plan to make sure that your consolidated plan process to make sure that you're effectively using those HOPWA dollars to meet need. And a big one is confidentiality standards. And if you don't have really good specific policies on these things, you're lucky because we have experts here at the Institute. We've already delved pretty deep into confidentiality. And there's sessions on use of resource ID for community needs assessment. I think there's at least one more of those sessions today if you haven't been in that. There's STRMU and income rent calculations, different things that you need policies on all those things, and there's sessions here around that. And we also have in the resource room, I believe until 3:30 today, Elizabeth Hendricks, who is a subject matter expert in consolidated planning. If you have any consolidated plan, action plan questions, take them straight to her. She is an expert in that and can help walk you through what needs to happen in your community around that. And, can help you figure out what should be in your policies around that as well. So more grantee basics, documentation requirements. This is a big one that we get a lot of questions around, particularly from project sponsors saying, do I have to do it that way? That's what my grantee wants. So if there's something that you need in your documentation, make sure that everyone knows what level of documentation is expected for things like eligibility, proof of rent reasonableness, staff time records. What are you asking for on those things? How often are you getting that? That's part of your policy. Is it on paper? Is it electronic? Do they hand deliver that to you? So spell it out, exactly what's expected of them. And how are you going to monitor that, and for what information? Data collection and reporting. So how often do you expect that? How are you going to process that at the grantee level? Invoicing. Sometimes we get into trouble with that. So how are we processing our invoicing? What policies do you have in place for that? How often will you monitor? What are you going to look for? What kind of oversight will you give? And that can include training in there too. And then standardized forms. If you have forms, don't just provide the form, provide a policy with that form on how to use it and what parts should be filled out and where does it go. And it may tie back into confidentiality. So all of that should come together. Okay. Now moving on to some project sponsor basics. These are big ones. Conflict of interest. And so many of us have policies around personally benefiting from the business, making decisions that would benefit you financially or your family members financially, receipt of gifts, nepotism. So those are some considerations. I believe there's a standard conflict of interest statement that many people follow. So you can look that up as well on the HUD Exchange. And the other two, fair housing and equal opportunity, and faith-based organizations, if applicable, those are standard forms or standard policies that you need to make sure that you're using the approved language and that you're actually following that and have procedures in place if necessary that match up to that policy. Okay. Oops. I keep forgetting your slides here.
Fade-ins.
Yeah. So a little bit more, project sponsor basics. Again, if you're a provider of services directly to clients and resources offered, make sure that you have really good descriptions of what those are. So that's not just what's in a brochure, in your public-facing messages. That should be also in your policies and procedures so that you're not saying one thing in your brochure and doing something else in reality. Make sure that you're providing that service based on a policy. Activity-specific policies. If you're a STRMU provider, how do you operate that? Tenant-based rental assistance, that's a whole manual all by itself. So I'm sure many of you are not, you know that you need a lot of information around that. It has to be clear. It has to be available to your clients that you serve. Eligibility requirements, that's a big one. Do you have a wait list? How do you manage that? Of course, eligibility, the standard is set by the statute, but if you change that or reduce the income level in particular, make sure that that's clear, that people are being treated in the same way, that you're not accepting one level of income here and another one there. And again, documentation requirements. Document. Make sure you have proof of everything. What are your requirements to provide services? For STRMU is a good example of that. What do you accept as proof that someone is at imminent risk of being homeless? more project sponsor basics, and this would also apply to grantees, of course, confidentiality standards. We're working on additional guidance around that as it relates to HMIS. But of course, it's not just about HMIS, it's also about lists and names and how are you protecting that information? Are you double locking? Are you triple locking? Do you have a policy on need to know only? Who can access what information? Make sure that you have that covered. And again, we've had a really great session about that already on confidentiality. What are your standards around due process and termination? If you haven't attended that session, I believe it's being repeated again today too. So make sure that you're following not only the statute for HOPWA, but what are the local or state laws around eviction. So you need to know that and make sure that you're compliant with those as well. Do you have participation requirements for your residents or for your recipients? That could be something like an occupancy agreement that had some specific details in it. If you have that in their occupancy agreement, spell that out in a policy as well and a procedure to make sure that you're carrying that out the same way for all of your residents. And then organizational financial management. So this isn't just the checks and balances that you're used to. You may want to include things around opening of mail, who receives checks and takes them to the bank if you still get paper checks and not just electronic. And do you have a board review of your financial systems, and how often does that happen? Do you have an audit policy, and what is that? How often do you change auditors? So all of those are things that should be part of your standard policies. So are we going to the deeper dive now? We're going to the deeper dive now. So we're going to talk about some activity-specific standards. So hopefully this will be a great opportunity to hear a little bit more about what you might want to include in those specific line item activities that you carry out. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan. Thanks.
Thank you, Rita, and good morning, everybody. Am I on the mic well enough? So I think I'll take a moment before jumping into the deeper dive to reiterate some of the points just from my TA provider perspective. We, as a TA provider working with HUD, often when we are engaged by HUD to work with the community is not necessarily under the best of circumstances. Perhaps there's been a HUD monitoring visit and some findings or concerns that have come out of that. And I think that kind of experience over the years, and I've worked with AIDS housing programs and HOPWA programs for about 20 years, the coming out of that experience is why the emphasis on having these written policies and procedures down. There's a whole variety of reasons, most of which have been touched on, but if the grantee has these written standards in place and clarified in contract documents or attachments to the contracts, that sort of thing, and if the sponsor has these written things in place, then everybody can know what their operating environment is, right? So when HUD monitors the grantee or the grantee does ongoing support and monitoring with the project sponsors, there's not mystery. The things are written down, the sponsor will know what the expectations are. They can more easily produce documentation for the grantee because they have standards in place that the files are going to look like XYZ. They're going to have these kind of documents. If they do TBRA program, the grantee can expect to see this list of documents. So it really helps make it easier for everybody. And when we get called in to work with grantees and project sponsors, it's usually to get these kind of things in place, and they ran into trouble perhaps because there weren't some standard operating procedures written down, and so something or other or multiple things had veered off course a bit. And so there was some compliance issues and questions about spending and documentation, client eligibility, unit eligibility, all sorts of things. These are really, we're emphasizing these to, they're tools to help kind of protect you as grantees and as project sponsors. The grantee is ultimately responsible for all the money that flows through them as a grantee. They're responsible to HUD. If HUD has a problem with a project sponsor, they'll hold the grantee responsible for that. So all of these are, again, tools to help help make the kind of a stable platform for everyone to work from, not just to here's the rules and you've got to follow them, and not it's really to make life a lot easier, because what you're doing is complicated. There's a lot of compliance issues that come up, and it just makes it kind of safer for everyone's operations to have these things thought through. And I'd want to emphasize a point that Rita touched on as well. For the clients, it makes it safer and more consistent for them. I started my career kind of on the direct community end of things as a housing advocate in a HOPWA program, but advocating, we weren't providing housing, we were trying to keep people in housing and get people into housing through an housing information services program. So a lot of my work was housing advocacy, and I worked with a lot of other supportive housing providers on the outside. And if a client of mine was having a problem in a housing program, the first question I would have is, show me it in writing where you say they're supposed to have done X, Y, and Z. 9 times out of 10, it wasn't in writing, and that's the starting point for advocating against a particular action that was being taken for a client. And so if you don't write it down, it's hard to enforce with your clients, grantee with your sponsors, and HUD with grantees. So that's why the emphasis, it makes it easier for everybody. So that's my little sermonette before. I'm a big believer in this. I've spent a lot of time over the years developing policies and procedures and trying to use them myself. I've been a housing provider as well, supportive housing, so I know the complications of being a housing provider for the target populations that we have. So what we're going to be doing here in this section, we're going to go into a little bit more detail, but as Rita said, we're not necessarily going to talk about what a policy should say, more that, because then we'd be here all day. But rather just kind of highlighting key points that we think are important areas to have policies about. So we'll certainly can entertain questions about what those policies might look like, but we're not necessarily giving guidance on all of these counts. And another thing to note, a lot of these policies and procedures that are discussed here and kind of a thread throughout a lot of the presentations here at the conference is they really hew pretty closely to HUD's own CPD monitoring exhibits. If you're familiar with that, that's the tool that your HUD field office will use when they visit a grantee, and often visit the project sponsors as well. It's a very specific set of questions. They'll be looking for specific documentation. Was eligibility documented in a file? Was rent calculated in a file? Is there a confidentiality policy in place? All of those things. So a lot of what we'll be discussing here kind of is mirrored from that. So all of this, again, is to help you have solid operations in place that will prepare you for any HUD monitoring if that comes along. So I think there's what we won't be going into is some of the obvious policies and procedures that you might have, like say about a TVRA program. Obvious policies and procedures might be just talking about how to apply to the program, how applications will be processed, how wait lists will be managed, that sort of thing. Those are kind of standard, where you'll definitely want a policy and procedure in place, as well as when you have something about your program that goes beyond the basic standard. And so what I mean by that is, like, say for a TBRA program, if you have a target population, or Rita mentioned if you, the income eligibility is 80% of AMI, say you target down to 50 or 30%, or say you target homeless people living with HIV/AIDS, and that's a requirement for your TBRA program. Those kind of things very definitely need to be written down because they are going beyond the HUD regulations and the kind of the baseline standards. So you want to have that in place. The local payment standards refers to with the TBRA program, you have to comply, the units have to fit in with the FMR, local FMR. But part of the flexibility with that is to adopt, if your local housing authority is adopt a set of payment standards that exceed the FMR, you can adopt that as well and still be compliant, but that would need to be documented. Need to be documented in writing because that's kind of going different than what's simply stated in the regulation. With the STRMU, same thing. I think there's a lot of variability in how this activity is applied across the country. I say that with a smile because it's remarkable how differently folks apply this activity. You don't often see a program that looks like another STRMU program. That's great, but that also means there's some real substantial differences the way people operate the program. Those kind of things, where you're coming from with your STRMU program as project sponsors needs to be documented. In defining what the need is, it's a needs-based eligibility. It's not just an income-based eligibility. It's a needs-based, what is your definition of need that you're using within your program? That needs to be spelled out, because again, clients need to know when they're eligible, how they show that they're eligible, and the people working with those clients, the advocates out in the community, need to know that as well. So it's very important to document what your standards for a STRMU project are in terms of that definition of eligibility. If you have any caps on assistance, that's important to capture as well. I see this a lot, and it's certainly allowable. You can read the STRMU guidance about it. It talks about caps on assistance and how that's allowable. What I mean by that is, there's the standard 21 weeks in a 52-week period, but a grantee or the project sponsor can articulate a narrower standard. They can put a dollar amount cap on it because the 21 weeks doesn't necessarily have a dollar limit. So I've seen dollar amount limits. I've seen reduction of the weeks allowable to a smaller amount, and I've seen project sponsors who make it it's not just 21 weeks in a 52-week period, it's 21 weeks ever in a lifetime. So it's a one-time only benefit for somebody to have access to. So all of those things are possible. They need to be well documented. They need to be approved by the grantee, and they really should be incorporated into the grantee's consolidated and action plans, because they are really shaping changing the program in a policy basis. A STRMU policy would also be how you're going to determine the 21 weeks. There's different ways to do it. That's also spelled out in the STRMU guidance. I won't go into great detail here, but that kind of thing. Again, it's important for people applying for the program to know what's the working framework, and their advocates as well. Facility-based housing, do you have target populations as well? What's the eligibility if you have a particular congregate or community-based or facility-based housing that you're serving? That needs to be well defined. Are there any, if you are managing a transitional program, what are the time limits? How is that measured? What happens at the end of that? All of that needs to be well spelled out in a policy and procedure and made available to participants in the program. And what's your housing model? There's a lot of varieties. I understand from conversations with colleagues, there's been some robust conversations in other sessions about housing first as an approach, which is definitely a perspective that the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing promotes. But that sort of thing should be reflected very clearly in what your housing model is that you're going to be employing, and so that anyone participating knows up front what's going to be expected. Documentation standards. Some of this is going to be redundant, so I'll won't spend a lot of time on it. But we talked about what your standards for eligibility are. You also want to have written out, and I'd suggest this for the grantee as well as the project sponsor, have articulated what your standards are for documenting, not just determining, but documenting eligibility. And that includes what kind of documentation will be acceptable for income, household composition, HIV status, determination of need for STRMU or TBRA or another resource. And if you have any prioritization, have that, how will that all be documented? And again, have that written, have it transparent to your clients, have it transparent to other people in the community who are referring people to your program. STRMU, the documentation there is very important. There's because of the money that's going out the door for STRMU as well as for TBRA programs, that documentation is really key, because that documentation needs to back up every dollar that's going out the door. So for STRMU, you need to, what's going to be acceptable in terms of documenting occupancy. If you're going to be paying for someone's rent, how do you document that they actually live there? And I think that those are important, because we've all likely, I'm going to make some assumptions, we've probably all seen cases where that hasn't necessarily been clear. I know I had that where I, scratching the surface about a application, would see that the occupancy, it wasn't actually clear that a client was in a particular unit. How will mortgage be documented? How will utilities bills be documented? That sort of thing. So have that in writing again, so everyone knows what it is. And when you're grantee for your project sponsors, when you're grantee monitors, so they know what to look for, right? Or as grantees, since most of you are grantees, have these things spelled out so that when you visit your project sponsors, you know what to look for, they know what to provide you, and it's not a mysterious thing for anybody. You've kind of spelled out in advance what kind of documents you're looking for. Household members, how will you document, how will you define a household especially for STRMU and for TBRA, especially for the TBRA assistance, how will you define the household? And what kind of income documentation will you be looking for? A lot of that is very prescribed by HUD and 24 CFR Part 5, which governs income calculation for multiple HUD programs, including HOPWA. But have that in writing, again, so that everybody knows what should be provided and what should be looked for. And then finally, I think it's always a great quality control tool for project sponsors and grantees to have something like a standardized file checklist in place, so that every file, if you're doing a TBRA program, and I will often refer to that because that one kind of has some of the heaviest documentations requirements, so many different things that have to be documented. If you're doing that, there's a lot of documentation that has to be gathered about the client, their income, the whole household, the unit, rent reasonableness, FMRs, inspections. There's lots of things that need to go into it. Having a checklist that the grantee and the sponsor both agree on for the client files is going to make everyone's life easier. The sponsor uses it for all those case managers. You've got turnover, you've got people coming and going. Maybe they're not familiar. a lot of folks aren't going to know every detail about the Code of Federal Regulations, right? But if you have something like a checklist, you don't have to know the entirety of the Code of Federal Regulations. You just have to go through the checklist and have a reasonable sense of what each document looks like. It's checked off, it's signed off on by the case manager or the supervisor, monitor. When the HUD grantee comes, if they look at a client file, they can look at that checklist, see that it was verified, maybe sample some of the documents, see if they're there. It just makes it all, it's good for quality control. You also want to have information, this is as a bullet in here, but information about your processes and documenting your processes. So how do people apply for your program? How do they get access to that resource? Again, have that written out so everyone knows what how to go about it, and staff aren't having to make it up on the fly. To continue on, rent payment calculations, I think everyone's familiar with that, but have specific standards in place about how income and rent will be calculated and what documents. So for a grantee, if you're going to be expecting to see rent calculation documentation in every file for either facility-based housing or tenant-based rental assistance, right? There are a variety of tools out there on the HUD Exchange and the HOPWA website. The HOPWA section, there's a administrative toolkit page that has a lot of sample documents that you can use. One of them is a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet that will help you calculate rent. So having a copy of something like that that's completely filled out, or of course there's the online, on HUD Exchange, the online rent calculator tool, which I highly recommend because that is a HUD official tool. You use that and you use it correctly, you can print out the kind of a document off of that. Once you've filled it out, it spits out what the rent amount's going to be, what the agency's rent amount's going to be, the client's rent amount's going to be, and it shows all of the work. You print it out, it's dated, you put it in the file, you've got an official documentation. So kind of how all that's going to be done, you want to have standards written down about what you expect as a grantee and as a sponsor. Unit eligibility, we've talked about that. All this needs to be documented. The grantee and the project sponsor will need to know what is expected for this documentation. What would documentation for rent reasonableness look like? For the fair market rent calculation look like? What documentation will the grantee accept for documentation of habitability standards and an inspection of a unit, again for TBRA? All that, again, should be spelled out in a policy, and ideally with some standardized documents that are being used across the community. Housing plans and case management, I think this is a big one. It's not, maybe not as clear in the same way that FMR or rent calculation is clear, that you've got to comply to a particular standard, but it's always worth noting that the HOPWA regulations require that grantees and their project sponsors ensure that everyone who receives HOPWA services, whether it's housing assistance or the supportive services, has their housing needs assessed and they are provided with access to care and support. So that's a grantee requirement, and it's worth for the grantee and their project sponsors to understand what does that mean, what will that look like, and how would it be documented in a client's file? What will it look like for your organization if you're a sponsor to show that you are doing housing assessments and housing planning? And for the grantee, what will you be looking for? And some grantees I've seen have very specific standards, and sometimes even a standard form they require all their project sponsors to use to do those assessments and housing plans. And then have policies in place about what kind of documentation will be needed for annual recertification, particularly for TBRA and for facility-based housing assistance. How will what's the schedule for that? What will the documentation be that will be looked at for updated household composition and for updated income? Financial management. There's a whole long financial management training that hopefully some of y'all have been able to get to. It's part of the management track that will go into a lot more detail, so we won't go into that kind of detail here. But it's important that, that as Rita already pointed out, that the sponsor especially have financial policies and procedures in place. So this is really more back office or agency level policies and procedures about how timekeeping, personnel timekeeping will be done, and what kind of documentation will suffice for adequate recording of time to back up billing to the grantee. Same thing on the grantee side. What does the grantee expect of its project sponsors in terms of documentation of time? All that needs to be, the grantee needs to know what they're looking for and what they expect. The sponsor needs to know what the grantee expects and how they're going to document it. So that's another place for policy and procedure that articulates how that will be done. Here's an important one covered in the financial management. There's even a breakout 30-minute just on treatment of direct and indirect costs. It's an important cost allocation policies, important organizational policy to have in place. And documentation oversight. I think I'd want to star this one a bit from my own practice as a provider and managing housing programs. This became an important tool for us to be able to try and keep track of our own quality and our own compliance. Was the who, how, and what of review and sign off on client records. So we, the organization that I work for, we had in place a whole system of for client files of a lot of documents had to be signed by the case manager or the direct care provider, and then countersigned on a regular basis by reviewed and countersigned by the supervisor, that individual's supervisor. And then there was, we were a large enough organization, we had our own internal monitor who kind of circulated through the programs. They would also, there was protocols for them to review and kind of sign off in the face page of the client files that they had reviewed the files as well. So having some standards in place for that, and think about it again as a quality control measure to make sure that the documentation that's being built up is sound and solid and kind of gets to what you need so that for your own protection, your client's protection, and your organization's protection. Confidentiality standards. Whole training on that the other night, whole session on that. That was very thorough. Benjamin Ayers' presentation was very thorough about the standards. There's the confidentiality guide that's on the hudexchange.info website on the HOPWA section that I'd recommend because it goes into a lot of good detail, and it was really what informed Ben's presentation. But you'll want to have written policies in place. I can't emphasize this enough. Written policies in place that addresses confidentiality and does a few things. It sets the minimum standards for consent to release information, right? It says what are the standards that you have in place to protect people's information. This is a heavy-duty grantee requirement. It's in the statute, it's in the regulation. The grantee is held responsible for the protection of client confidentiality. So just as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the little sermon, the grantee is on the line for what the project sponsor does. So the grantee will want to make sure that the project sponsor has good standards in place and good practices in place in this area. And we've seen legal action as a result of it, that it affects grantees and affects project sponsors. So it's a serious issue. So you want to have policies in place that talk about consent, describe how someone's status will be protected in particular, and how their confidentiality in general will be honored. On a functional level, how records will be protected, whether paper records or electronic records. So Rita mentioned with paper records and files, and Ben went into detail about that, both on the electronic side and the paper side, about the having that. But you'll want to have it written out, because if it's not written out, it's hard to enforce, and if it's not written out, it exposes you as an organization to vulnerability. If you don't have a policy for something as important as this in place, don't have a policy, or if you have a policy and don't really follow it. Both of those can be real problems for people. And as Ben talked about the other night, how will you handle it if the inevitable happens, because it does happen, and someone's privacy is breached? Have a protocol in place for what you will do, how you'll communicate with the client about what happened, how you will respond to it, and what changes you would make. I think we're going to have a good time for questions and answers when we get to the end here. We're doing pretty good. Program agreements. This is the client advocate in me that wanted to make sure this was in here. I'm not necessarily a big fan of program agreements and those kind of requirements for participation in a HOPWA program. But if you do use one, that's personal opinion. I'm not speaking for HUD. But if you do use one, make sure it's a thoughtful one, and make sure that it's written, and make sure that it's clear and communicated with your clients, right? So a program agreement can be useful to clarify any rights and responsibilities, both on the part of the client and the part of the agency. And I'd emphasize that latter part. I think it's always important in the work that we do and that you do to communicate your responsibilities to the clients, not just the other way around, that what they're responsible for you, but what you're going to provide, what they can expect of you in terms of services, in terms of expectations, protections, that sort of thing. Very much you want to have articulated, whether it's in a program agreement or just as a general policy, what are the grounds for termination. That, as an advocate, that's what I would always ask for, is show me the document that shows how you do your termination process and what are the grounds for termination. If a client, someone I was working with, was being terminated from a housing program, and again, very often there was no such thing, and that kind of put a stop to the whole process. So as a program yourself, it's very reasonable that you'll have circumstances where you'll need to terminate a client, right? Someone from participating in your program. Have it written out, because if you don't have it written out, you don't really have grounds to do it. So if someone didn't know something was expected or what recourse they had, then it's hard to ever enforce it, at least if an advocate or legal aid gets involved. And then any participation expectations. Again, if they're there, it needs to be spelled out. They need to have consented to it to participate in the program in the first place. Client would need to be very clear about what the ramifications are for failure to participate in a prescribed way in your program and that sort of thing. So all of these are protections for you, for the client, for the grantee, because all of this ties in together. So how do you go about developing them? It's not super secret, but it is time consuming. Having worked on them with organizations very often in the process of doing that now with a HOPWA grantee, they're going to be unique and tailored to the organization's needs, the grantee's needs, and what activities they fund, and in any particular policies they have. But I would suggest that you start with an internet search. There are some of you all may have your own policies and procedures out there on the web already. That is great for the rest of us to go and steal those policies and procedures and mine them for pieces that are useful. And they vary quite a bit, but I'm always glad to see that they're out there and that they're available for someone like myself to pull and share with someone I might be working with. There's a lot of HOPWA guidance materials out there and HUD regulations, of course, out there. One of the main things that I do when working with a grantee or a project sponsor on policies and procedures is trying not to reinvent the wheel. And where possible, we'll take 100% straight out of a piece of HOPWA guidance. If it meets the bill and it kind of says what I want to say, we'll just take it out, put it in, and now it's the policy. And you're not, for a lot of the policies and procedures, you're not creating policy, right? Only when you're doing something like setting a cap that goes above and beyond the HOPWA regs is that kind of creating policy. A lot of it is just getting what's required already in writing and operational for you to use and for your staff to use, right? So a lot of it can be cut and paste and grabbing it from lots of different resources, whether it's TA guidance or other guidance. If for the grantees, if you're doing policies and procedures, would very much suggest that you consult with your community stakeholders, that those not be developed in a vacuum, that they be coordinated with your, developed in consultation with your project sponsors, that they be coordinated, as Rita said earlier, with planning and procurement documents so that they reflect each other. One of the things is often a part of TA that I'm providing to a HOPWA grantee is to not only work on, say, some written standards for their program, but translating that into their contract documents. Because that contract document for the grantee is the vehicle for enforcement and for communication. That's a nicer way to put it. Communication of expectations to a project sponsor of what the grantee expects. And even if that's just communicating what's already in regulations, it's all part of the same chain. The grantee can't assume that the sponsor is an expert on the HOPWA regulations. The grantee shouldn't assume that they are an expert on the HOPWA regulations. So you put together these kind of documents so that everyone has references to refer to standardize, and incorporating them into contract documents is, I think, a key part. And then turning that around and educating project sponsors about, here's this document and here's our expectations. And then it's always, especially if you think that you're getting into a policy question that goes beyond regulations, to review with your local field office. With project sponsors, if your grantee has these kind of documents, certainly start from there. Grantee may have required documents, forms for you to use, so that's just going to be incorporated in your own. It goes without saying, consult with clients as you're developing program policies and procedures, so that your program and your framework is developed in a responsive way to the folks you're serving. Make sure that it's reviewed by senior management, because at the sponsor level, it's the organization that's going to be responsible for the actions of the case managers. So the case manager shouldn't be or frontline staff necessarily creating policy. Ultimately, management or leadership at an organization is going to be held responsible, and that will flow up to the grantee too. Ultimately, the grantees are really held responsible if there's a real issue. So it's suggested to review with the grantee as well and kind of get their buy-in on what you are doing. So, almost done. Oh, I need to aim down here. Not at the screen. Care and feeding of your policies and procedures. Having already said, don't overthink them and get caught up in making them perfect, because I've been there myself, gotten caught up in policies and procedures process that I was so worried about getting it right that it was impossible to kind of get it done. Try and use what's out there and what's already in writing and in guidance to get a framework to start. And once you have them, don't keep it on the shelf. Put it into action. Share it with your staff. If you're at the sponsor level, if you're the grantee, make sure your sponsors have it, and that you don't just have it at your level and they know nothing about what you're requiring or expecting. And make it a document that is, as I said, incorporated into all of your grant management, whether you're project sponsor or grantee. It's part of the contracts. It's part of your annual self-evaluation at the sponsor level of what you're doing, how you're doing it. It's part of the grantees monitoring, all of that. The grantee, we talked about this, incorporating some of these elements into your contract. If you have a specific invoicing, financial or reporting documents that they need to use to report data, make sure it's clear what activities a sponsor is funded for. I can't tell you how often I still see that with a grantee and a sponsor. The grantee can't even really say what a particular sponsor is funded for, and the sponsor, in looking at it, isn't doing exactly or not at all what the grantee thought they were doing. Still happens. So that the contract document is where all this kind of coordinates together, says what you're funded for, and what the standards for operating are. This is a hard to see slide, but there's the link up there. Is anyone here from Texas? Oh, they left? This slide's for them. But I told Blake Berkman knew that I was using had already put this slide in. But the state of Texas, they're just using them. They're a good example. This is the Balance of State HOPWA grant, so there's a number of municipal grantees as well. The Balance of State's a huge state. It takes days to drive across, so they communicate their standard policies and procedures through a very well organized and full website that they've had up for years, and it continues to change. I've been pointing people to it for years, and every time I go there, there's usually more material or updated material. And they have a very well-developed HOPWA manual that has some things that are very Texas specific and definitely has policies that may not translate to everyone's use, but it's a very well-organized document. But what I wanted to point to is the format that they use for putting it up on the internet it's just very user-friendly. And so all of their sponsors, they have a question, they go there, they can't find the master form that they're supposed to be using, they can't find a copy, they go to the website, download it, they've got the current dated copy of whatever form it is, they have it, and they know that they're all kind of using the latest, greatest guidance that the grantee has. Not on here, but on their website is because they're a big state, they do a lot of online training, the grantee does, and they record it. So those recordings are up there as well. So it's that kind of thing. It's a very robust kind of active use, and that is how the state kind of gets some consistency and quality control across such a large geographic area, is by having on the web. And you don't have to be a large geographic area to find it valuable to have it on the web. So I always encourage grantees to put any standardized documents and manual or HOPWA policies that they have on the web, and same with project sponsors. For project sponsors, those will be useful for all the clients who will come to you, and anyone working with those clients who come to you. They can see what you do, they see what the forms are, they know what to expect, they know where you're coming from, that sort of thing. With policies and procedures, whether grantee or sponsor level, train. I think it's always healthy to cross-train at the grantee level, especially so that you're not the only person in the city that knows anything about managing the HOPWA program, because that can be a real kind of vulnerability to a grantee. And then I already mentioned make materials available to your community partners. Update and review them regularly, because if you've got standards of care and policies and procedures and forms in place that are actively used and worth much, you're going to have to update them. You're going to realize once you've put them out there that you need to change something, and so don't be surprised that happens. You're never going to get it all right or set at once. It's going to be constantly evolving as your funding changes or as your other programs that your HOPWA grants interact with change. You'll probably be changing your policies and procedures as well.